her arms crossed on her chest like this throughout this whole situation. And this situation was about a few minutes long. So this is really a strong sign of her trying to shield herself. Today we're looking at a new Netflix documentary called The Perfect Neighbor, which has already been viewed by over 16 million people. And it's currently the most watched film on the platform. The story of The Perfect Neighbor is emotional, it's gripping, and unfortunately, it's also tragic. But beneath big dramatic headlines lies something far more complex. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at this story from a psychological lens, and we'll explore how trauma can sometimes blur the lines between self-defense and aggression. Hi and welcome to Sense of Synergy channel. I'm Carolina and I'm a hypnopsychotherapist, mindfulness meditation teacher, and I have almost 10 years of working experience in the mental health sector. If you're interested in topics like mental health, trauma, personal growth, development, and the process of healing, make sure you stick around on this channel. When we're looking at situations like this through a trauma-informed perspective, through a psychological perspective, we're not trying to find an excuse for the person who committed the crime or took someone's life. We're not minimizing the tragedy that happened here. But what we are trying to do is to step away just a little bit from this black and white judgmental thinking about stories like this. Not to justify, but to understand. To ask, why did this person do this? What led to it? And to understand how unprocessed trauma doesn't only leave an imprint on the person themselves, but also can leave an imprint on people or even communities around them. And ultimately, with this awareness and with this knowledge, we can potentially look at preventing future harm from happening. The story of The Perfect Neighbor centers around Susan Lorincz, who fatally shot a mother of four, Ajika Owens, in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Florida. The incident happened after almost 2 years of ongoing and growing tensions and conflicts between Susan and the families in the neighborhood. Over those months, Susan made repeated and persistent phone calls to the police, reporting that the children from the local houses cause her nuisance, disturbance, that they're being loud, that they're trespassing on her property, and that she feels disturbed and harassed. When someone experiences trauma, their nervous system can get stuck in a constant state of alertness, which we call hypervigilance. By shifting to this heightened awareness, alertness, and vigilance, your brain and body are adapting after those overwhelming traumatic experiences. And hypervigilance is a protective mechanism designed to help you identify, detect, and also respond to threats quicker and more effectively in the future. But the problem is this hypervigilance state doesn't necessarily have an automatic off switch, and it can persist over time regardless of the situations or circumstances in your life. So what happens when the threat isn't there anymore, but your nervous system remains in this hypervigilant state? Over the course of 2 years, Susan has made numerous phone calls to the police, claiming that she was being disturbed, disrespected, or even harassed. What would normally be a neutral or potentially a slightly irritating experience or occurrence, children playing outside, making noises, laughing, screaming, shouting, for Susan, it became a perceived threat, a signal of danger. And we see that this escalates over time. So Susan's interest in what's going on outside of the house, who's playing out there, whose children are there, becomes preoccupying. It becomes obsessive. And as time goes, we also start to see elements of paranoia, where she almost nitpicks Little things, the smallest interactions, the smallest noises that are happening outside of the house, and makes it mean something threatening or dangerous towards her. So this story illustrates how chronic hypervigilance state can actually warp and distort person's perception of reality. The person may be convinced that they're protecting themselves from something or someone, that whatever they're doing, it's in self-defense. But actually, if there is no real threat there, and the perception of threat is coming from a hypervigilant nervous system who's constantly signaling there's a threat there, or even misinterpreting certain situations or interactions or stimuli as threatening, that person may actually end up being the perpetrator or the source of violence themselves because they're reacting to a threat that isn't there. Traumatic memories are stored differently than normal memories. Memories of situations that were overwhelming, stressful, or traumatic are stored not only in our brain, but also in our body through the sensory channels. So through things like what we see, what we hear, even smells. And this is why certain triggers like raised voices or sudden unexpected sounds and noises can evoke flashbacks or a sudden instant overwhelm of panic or terror or distress. In these moments, it's like your brain and body are reliving that traumatic event all over again. It's like that event that happened in the past is happening again in the present moment, right here and now. And we may suspect that for Susan, the sound or the noise of children playing, laughing, shouting, having fun outside of her house wasn't just a noise. To her nervous system, it may have been read as a signal of perceived danger or threat of some kind. And therefore, her reactions turned into a self-defense mechanism. And we see this ultimate escalation of Susan's perceived sense of unsafety, that a sense of danger, when Ajika comes to her door to confront her about the way Susan treated her children. During police investigations, Susan repeatedly said words like, she was shouting that she was going to kill me, or it was constant banging on the door, constant banging on the door. And unfortunately, we won't get to hear Ajika's side of the story of what happened on that day in front of that door. But considering Susan's chronic hypervigilance state and how hyper alert she would have been at that point to any potential sign of threat or danger, we may question whether her description or account of what happened on that night is actually accurate and objective. And essentially, there is a possibility where some of the things that Susan is describing that Ajika did on that night may have not happened, or they've happened in a slightly different way than she described them. But again, unfortunately, we won't get to hear the full truth here. Intense emotions and high levels of stress can also disrupt our perception of time or a sense of time. And I'm sure you have at least one situation that you can think of in your life where time felt like it was stretched out, like things were happening in slow motion. Or on the opposite, as if you blinked and you didn't know what happened, when, and how, as if things happened in a flash. Traumatic memories are stored in the implicit memory in our brain, which often means that they're not fully integrated into the timeline or the storyline of your life. So this essentially means that to your brain, those traumatic memories don't necessarily belong fully to the past, and they don't also belong to the present. And this is why whenever those traumatic memories are triggered by something in the present moment, they feel so alive in us. We feel them so vividly. It almost feels like we're fully reliving that specific moment that happened in the past. And for Susan, her heightened state of awareness, alertness, and vigilance made moments feel longer, more intense, and therefore more threatening and overwhelming because of how focused she was on them. And again, during police interviews, we see that Susan claims that Ajike had been banging on her door for about 5 to 10 minutes. But police evidence quickly shows that when Susan called the police to report the situation, she hung up the phone and must have shot Ajike within a space of 2 minutes from that phone call. So again, we see the disruption in her sense of and perception of reality, and in this case, specifically timeline. A common thread in many traumatic experiences is an overwhelming and paralyzing feeling of being trapped. And this feeling can sneak back into our present life unexpectedly when it's triggered by something that echoes that original pain, that original traumatic event that happened in the past. And when that happens, unfortunately, it happens regardless of whether the present, current circumstances and situations are threatening or whether they're actually safe and okay for us. As conflicts and tensions between Susan and the neighbors continued to grow, we also learn about another interesting incident that took place around that time. Susan claimed that someone locked her up accidentally inside of a towing yard where she was trying to fix her car. And in her words, this made her feel really trapped. In response to that, she repeatedly rammed her car into the front gate, damaging it unrepairably. Obviously, this is a very impulsive and aggressive way of responding to a situation like this. And I'm sure most people would probably find completely different ways of trying to escape or leave this situation without damaging someone's property. But this is why it's interesting to look at the why behind Susan acted in such a rash and dramatic way to this situation. It's possible that for Susan, this situation was like an emotional trigger or even an emotional flashback that took her right to an experience that may have happened in the past when she felt trapped without control. And her reaction can be described as a survival reaction because of how intense and impulsive it was. And it's almost like a mixture between a fight reaction, because she did actually damage property, damage something, and a flight reaction because she was doing that in order to escape and flee. Interestingly, another situation where we see those survival mechanisms and patterns of behavior is when Susan is faced with an arrest for manslaughter. When police officers came back and informed Susan that she will be arrested, her behavior changed drastically. She completely refused to cooperate with the police officers. She refused to stand up, to move. She was sitting in the chair, completely still, not budging, repeating the same words over and over again. I just can't do this. I just can't. Now, I'm sure that many people who have watched this scene in the film have thought how stubborn Susan is, how irrationally she's behaving right now, because of course she's going to get arrested either way, whether she's going to move by will or whether she's going to be forced to move. So there's no way of avoiding this right now. Some people may have thought that, she's throwing a tantrum, that she's just being difficult, right? But we can look at this from a different perspective. And when we look at verbal and non-verbal signs in Susan's behavior, we see symptoms and signs of a freeze response, which is a survival response. And in fact, it's a survival response of last resort when we've got nothing else left to do. I'll come back to that in a second. We also see something else that is often linked to the freeze response, which is slowed cognitive processing. What do I mean by that? So, when we're relaxed, when everything's fine around us and in us, we can normally verbalize ourselves quite well. We can put words into sentences and create more elaborate sentences, longer sentences, and just create speech that makes sense in general. In moments of high stress or high emotions or traumatic events, we don't have as much ability to access and use the language centers in our brain, as well as other like rational centers of our brain. So essentially, what happens is in those moments of high stress, our speech can become rather short or simple. So we may be using just few words or very short phrases, very short sentences. Another thing that can happen is our speech becomes repetitive. So we find ourselves saying the same thing over and over again. And in Susan's case, we see both of those things happen when she keeps repeating exactly the same words constantly. I just can't do this. But often, when we're too overwhelmed to speak and verbalize, our body tells the story and it shows what's really happening inside of us. And in Susan's case, we also see a lot of non-verbal signs of her survival reaction and the things that are going on in her. So she adopts this very protective, self-defensive posture throughout this situation. We see that she's got these hunched shoulders, almost as if she was trying to shrink herself, make herself look smaller, less visible. And again, from evolutionary perspective, from survival perspective, this is what we do. This is what animals do when they feel like the threat, the danger they're facing is too big, too overwhelming, too strong, and they may not be able to either fight it or flee from it. They try to look smaller and try to disappear. Another thing we see is that her body is quite stiff. She's just sitting in this chair, not budging, not moving, just very stiff, almost as if she's bracing herself for potentially the police officers having to pick her up or move her or create some kind of physical intervention to arrest her. And finally, and I think most interestingly, and this is the first thing I noticed when I was watching this scene, her arms crossed on her chest like this throughout this whole situation. And I mean, this situation was about a few minutes long. So this is really a strong sign of her trying to shield herself from unwanted touch, unwanted physical interaction or intervention. So again, protecting herself from perceived threat that is imminent. Taking all these verbal and non-verbal cues and behaviors into an account, it may suggest that this was the moment when the looming consequences of her actions were finally arriving in her kind of mind, when she was realizing fully the weight of what has happened. And I think sitting there in that chair with three or two police officers in front of her telling her, you're going to be arrested, there's no way out of this, you either cooperate or you don't, but it's going to happen. We can suspect that this was the moment where she felt the almost the ultimate overwhelming flood of this feeling of being trapped, because she knew, even on the subconscious level, that there is no way she's getting out of this. There's nowhere to go, and there's no way of fighting this right now. And in these situations where fighting or fleeing is not an option and the threat is imminent and it's overpowering, all that we've got left to do is to freeze and to try make ourselves look smaller, less visible, and to hope for the survival. It's essentially this really paralyzing, physically debilitating state where your body authentically feels frozen or stiff or still. So again, we see those kinds of signs in Susan in this moment. And I think when talking or even listening about stories like this one, you can't help but think, what if? What if one of those police officers who Susan had contact with throughout those months, because she was making persistent, constant, almost weekly phone calls to the police reporting what was going on? What if one of those officers would have picked up on Susan's behavior, seeming quite irrational, that she was misinterpreting neutral things as threatening, as dangerous, that her behaviors could have stemmed from a traumatic reaction? And maybe, just maybe, if she would have been given and offered mental health treatment and support earlier, this tragedy could have been prevented. What were your thoughts about The Perfect Neighbor? Did this video help you to see this situation from a different angle? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, and if you want to learn more about how mental health and trauma are portrayed in TV series and films that we all watch, hit that subscribe button for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you later.